It began with a toddler fighting for her life in a small-town hospital, and ended with a man the community thought they knew standing trial for crimes too monstrous to comprehend. Before the headlines, before the outrage, there was only a quiet street in Brookhaven, Louisiana, and a man named Derrick Raymond Walker who seemed to live an ordinary life. But behind that calm exterior, behind the slow drawl and polite nods, he was carrying a secret that would eventually infect and shatter two families, and expose one of the darkest cases the state had ever seen. In Brookhaven, people kept to themselves. It wasn't the kind of town where doors stayed unlocked anymore, but it was still the kind where folks waved from porches and believed they knew who lived beside them. Derrick Walker was one of those people, quiet, unassuming, a man who looked more tired than dangerous. He fixed lawn mowers, helped older neighbors with groceries, and minded his business. That, in Brookhaven, was enough to make him invisible. He rented a small house at the far end of Cedar Lane, with a pavement cracked into gravel and the sound of cicadas filled the evenings. Those who remembered his past, a conviction years ago for an offense involving a minor, didn't say much. He'd done his time. The world had moved on, or so everyone thought. In December 2013, that illusion unraveled. A young woman rushed into St. Luke's Regional Medical Center, carrying her 23-month-old niece, Alyssa Grant. The child was feverish, crying in pain, her small body covered in marks the family couldn't explain. Within hours, the test came back, and the hospital fell silent. Alyssa was infected with HIV, genital herpes, and chlamydia, 3 separate sexually transmitted diseases. In a toddler, when detectives from the Brookhaven Police Department arrived, they were met by terrified relatives and a pediatric specialist who could barely hide her horror. "This child was assaulted," she said flatly. "This wasn't an accident." Officers ordered tests for every adult in the home. Days later, the results returned. Only one person matched: Derrick Raymond Walker. The same man who'd been convicted years before for assaulting a child. The same man who lived just blocks away. The same man neighbors trusted enough to babysit. The detective stared at the printout. The match was beyond coincidence. The virus subtype, the history, the proximity, all of it pointed to him. But as investigators soon discovered, Alyssa wasn't the only one. As officers built their case, another name surfaced: Mariah Danvers, a quiet 14-year-old who had vanished from school records a year before. When they found her, she told them a story that would leave seasoned investigators speechless. One that began when she was just 12 and ended with her carrying a secret no child should ever bear. Like Alyssa, Mariah was sick. Like Alyssa, she carried the same infections. And like Alyssa, she pointed to one man. On Cedar Lane, the porch light at Walker's house still flickered on every night at 9 o'clock sharp, glowing through the humid dark. Neighbors thought he was keeping to himself again. They didn't know that police were circling, that a grand jury indictment was being prepared, that a small child's pain had triggered the unraveling of everything he'd tried to hide. In Brookhaven, evil had worn the face of an ordinary man and had been living there all along. It was the second child that turned the investigation from tragedy to nightmare. While detectives were still processing the horror of what had happened to little Alyssa Grant, another name reached their desks: a teenager from the next parish over. Her file was slim: a few school attendance notes, a withdrawn report from a youth counselor, and a pregnancy test log 6 months prior. Her name was Mariah Danvers, and when detectives knocked on her door, she didn't flinch. She had been expecting them. Mariah lived with her grandmother in a quiet corner of East Parish, a few miles from Brookhaven. Her voice was soft, her frame smaller than her age suggested. When Detective Calvin Price sat across from her at the kitchen table, he noticed her hands trembled every time she reached for a glass of water. "You already know what this is about," he said gently. Mariah nodded. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, the truth began to spill out. She met Derrick Raymond Walker when she was 12. He wasn't family, but he might as well have been. Someone her relatives trusted, a man who offered rides to school and small favors when her grandmother's car broke down. It started innocently enough. She said, rides, gifts, promises. He told her she was mature, that she was different, that he understood her. By 13, the abuse had begun. Mariah spoke in fragments, her voice shaking as she described nights spent in Walker's truck parked behind an old lumber yard or at the small rental house on Cedar Lane. He'd told her to keep it secret, said nobody would believe her. He said it was love. When she turned 14, she discovered she was pregnant. Walker panicked. He told her to stay quiet, that he'd handle it. Weeks later, she miscarried. At the hospital, tests revealed she was HIV positive, along with herpes and chlamydia. The doctor who broke the news had seen enough cases to know it wasn't coincidence. For months, Mariah carried that knowledge in silence. Her grandmother thought the illness came from a bad transfusion. Mariah let her believe it. She wanted to forget. But when she saw the news coverage about a toddler with the same infections, something inside her cracked. She recognized the name, the same man, the same sickness. That's when she decided to speak. Detectives didn't interrupt. They let her story unfold, word by word, the same way trauma often does, slowly, painfully, in waves. When she finished, they asked if she'd be willing to make a statement. She nodded again. "I don't want to hurt anyone else," she said quietly. It was enough. Within hours, the Brookhaven Police Department and East Parish prosecutors pulled evidence from both investigations. The viral patterns in Mariah's blood matched those in Alyssa's. The infections, the timeline, the connection, they all pointed to Walker. Forensic examiners combed through his home on Cedar Lane, collecting toothbrushes, clothing, used syringes, anything that could hold trace DNA. The samples came back contaminated with his viral strain. It was as if he'd left a fingerprint only science could see. When detectives arrived at his house with an arrest warrant, Walker didn't resist. He looked almost calm, his hands loose at his sides. "You people always find someone to blame," he muttered. His voice had no urgency, no fear, just fatigue. As he was led away, neighbors watched from behind curtains. No one said a word. They had all seen him mowing his lawn just days before, waving at kids as they rode past on their bikes. Now, that same man was accused of infecting a toddler and a teenager with a virus that would alter their lives forever. At the precinct, Walker denied everything. He said he'd been framed, that people were out to ruin him. But his medical records told another story. The East Parish District Attorney's Office now had the building blocks of a case that could send him to prison for life. They charged him with 2 counts of sexual assault of a child, one classified as super aggravated due to the toddler's age. In Louisiana law, that charge meant there would be no leniency, no parole, and no chance of a reduced sentence. Mariah's courage became the backbone of the prosecution. For months, she endured medical exams, courtroom rehearsals, and endless questions. Each time she spoke, her voice steadied a little more. Each time she walked into the courthouse, she was reclaiming something he had tried to take. Behind her, Alyssa's family followed the case in silence, trapped between grief and rage. The little girl was on antiretroviral medication now, too young to understand why. Her mother pinned her hospital bracelets to a corkboard, a silent record of everything her daughter had survived. And through it all, Derrick Walker sat in his jail cell, expressionless, waiting for a trial to expose every lie he'd built his life upon. Brookhaven had seen storms and flood before, but nothing like this. This was the kind of devastation that didn't destroy buildings. It destroyed trust. No one on Cedar Lane ever left their doors unlocked again. By the time Derrick Raymond Walker faced trial, the town of Brookhaven had already made its silent verdict. His name carried a weight that neighbors couldn't say aloud. They saw his face in the newspaper and could no longer connect it to the man who once fixed their lawnmowers or waved at children on Cedar Lane. What was unfolding inside the courthouse was something no one could reconcile. A man accused of violating 2 children, spreading a virus that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The courtroom was full on the morning the trial began. People came not for spectacle, but because disbelief needed evidence. Walker, in an ill-fitted gray suit, sat motionless. He looked smaller than the stories made him, yet the atmosphere around him was sharp with disgust. The jury watched him with a stillness that felt like restraint. Assistant District Attorney Lena Brooks opened the state's case with the calm of someone who had prepared for years. She told the jurors this was not a case of misunderstanding or rumor. It was a pattern of exploitation. She spoke of how Walker used his trust as access and his silence to inflict damage that medicine could treat but never erase. When she said the names Alyssa Grant and Mariah Danvers, the courtroom fell into a heavy quiet. 2 children, 2 lives permanently marked by the same man. The defense, led by Calvin Rhodes, urged caution. He claimed there was no eyewitness, no confession, only a rush to judgment based on medical coincidence. But the evidence would speak louder than either side. Doctors from St. Luke's Regional Medical Center were the first to testify. Their charts told a story more horrifying than words could manage. The toddler's injuries, the infections, the timing. Every detail pointed toward deliberate assault. One physician's voice trembled when he described how rare it was for a child so young to contract those diseases except through direct, invasive contact. He did not need to say the word. Everyone already understood. An infectious disease specialist followed. He had compared the viral strains found in the victims to Walker's medical profile. Under oath, he explained that the genetic markers matched so precisely that the likelihood of coincidence was almost zero. The jurors stared at the charts projected on the wall. Red lines connecting samples, each line a strand of truth weaving them together. The science left little room for disbelief. The defense cross-examined for hours, trying to poke holes in the process. Lab error, chain of custody, contamination, but every technician's log was flawless. Every timestamp, every sample label, every signature reinforced the integrity of the findings. By the time the last witness stepped down, the evidence was unshaken. When Mariah Danvers took the stand, the courtroom seemed to forget to breathe. She was 16 now, but the years since the assault showed in her posture, rigid, wary, older than her age. She described how Walker had earned her trust, how he turned kindness into control. Her testimony was clear and without embellishment. The jurors didn't need dramatics. The simplicity of her truth was enough. She told them how she had been 12 when it began, 14 when she found out she was pregnant, and how the illness that followed took away any illusion that what he'd done was love. Every sentence drew the jury deeper into a silence that felt unending. Walker didn't look at her once. His expression didn't change, even when she spoke about the threats he made to keep her quiet. Only his fingers twitched when the prosecutor asked whether she feared him. "Not anymore," she said. The sound of that answer seemed to close a door that had been open too long. When closing arguments arrived, Brooke spoke with the same restraint she had carried from the start. She told the jurors that the case was built on proof, medical, forensic, historical, and on courage. The courage of a teenager who spoke the truth, and a family that refused to let a toddler's suffering be another unsolved tragedy. She asked them to see past the man's quiet demeanor to the pattern of harm he had woven through 2 lives. Rhodes had little left to say. He warned of overreach, of the power of public outrage, of the risk of letting emotion overshadow evidence. But there was nothing abstract about the pain described on the stand, and no emotion could distort the precision of science. The jury retired before noon. 3 hours later, they returned. No one spoke as the foreman stood. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The words seemed to echo against the wooden walls before anyone moved. Walker sat still, eyes fixed on the table, as if the sound came from another world. The judge read the sentence, life imprisonment without parole, and the courtroom exhaled. It wasn't triumph, just a release of long-held breath. Outside, the sky was gray with thin rain. Alyssa's mother stood beneath the courthouse canopy, holding her daughter close. Whispering words meant more for herself than anyone listening. Justice had come, but it could not undo what was done. On Cedar Lane, Walker's house remained dark, its windows shuttered, the mailbox filled with uncollected flyers, and weeds began to climb the fence. People passed by quickly, avoiding the glance, as though the ground itself had memory. Brookhaven had always been quiet, but now its silence carried weight. It was the kind that lingers after truth has stripped away every illusion of safety. The trial was over, but justice didn't bring peace. In Brookhaven, the courthouse doors had barely closed before the story began to ripple through every street, diner, and church pew. People whispered in grocery lines, on porches, and in hushed phone calls, trying to make sense of how something so monstrous could have existed beside them for years. They remembered seeing Derrick Raymond Walker fixing his old truck, buying groceries, waving politely. And now they knew what he'd been hiding behind that calm, ordinary face. For the families, the sentence was not an ending. It was a beginning they never wanted. At St. Luke's Regional Medical Center, a toddler named Alyssa Grant sat in a hospital bed surrounded by stuffed animals and 4 drips. The nurses adored her. She smiled when they played with her curls, laughed when they blew bubbles, but her laughter never lasted long. She was too young to understand the pills she had to swallow every morning, too young to know why her mother cried in the hallway after every appointment. Her tiny body was fighting a war she hadn't chosen, against a virus that would never leave her. Her mother, Rachel Grant, had stopped counting the days. Her calendar was filled with medical appointments instead of birthdays and playdates. At night, when the house was quiet, she would sit on the edge of her bed and whisper to herself, "She's still here. That's enough for now." But the thought that Alyssa's suffering had come from someone within their own family tree haunted her relentlessly. Forgiveness was impossible, forgetting even more so. In another part of town, Mariah Danvers walked the edge of a new life that felt both fragile and unfamiliar. After the trial, she withdrew from school for nearly a year. The stares, the questions, the way people said her name with pity, it was too much. She told her grandmother she needed time to breathe. Therapy sessions became her new routine. There were days when she sat in silence, tracing the scars on her wrists where IVs had once been, wondering if her life had already been written before she had the chance to live it. But Mariah was not the same girl who once trembled at Walker's threats. She had faced him in court, looked into the eyes of her abuser, and spoken the truth he'd spent years burying. That moment replayed in her mind like a heartbeat, proof that he no longer owned her. Still, the aftermath wasn't linear. Some days she woke up with purpose. Other days, she stayed in bed until the sun disappeared. Healing had no pattern, only persistence. The East Parish District Attorney's Office called her several times after conviction, offering counseling, victim support funds, follow-ups on her medical treatment. She appreciated it, but what she wanted most couldn't be offered on a form. She wanted the years back, the one stolen before she even understood what was taken. Brookhaven tried to move forward, but its quiet had changed. Neighbors no longer let their children wander the sidewalks alone. The local church held candlelight vigils, not only for Alyssa and Mariah, but for every unseen child who might still be living with secrets too heavy to speak aloud. One pastor said during a sermon, "Evil doesn't arrive with horns. Sometimes it comes wearing work boots and a smile." The congregation sat in silence, their minds all drifting to the same face. The remnant of Walker's life sat untouched at the end of Cedar Lane. His house was boarded up, the grass reaching knee-high. A single window remained cracked open, its curtain moving faintly in the wind. The neighbors avoided looking at it for too long. They said it felt wrong, like staring at something cursed. For months, rumors spread that the property would be torn down, but the paperwork stalled. It stood there as a reminder of everything Brookhaven wanted to forget. Alyssa's family often passed that house on their way to the hospital. Her mother avoided the rearview mirror until they had driven far enough that the roof disappeared behind the trees. Sometimes, in the back seat, Alyssa would hum softly to herself, oblivious to the weight that followed their car. As the first year after the trial approached, Mariah began writing again. Her therapist suggested journaling to confront the memories rather than run from them. At first, the pages were short, detached, lists of appointments, emotions she couldn't name. But over time, they turned into letters she never sent. Letters to her younger self, to the girl who believed she was loved, to the woman she hoped to become. Each word carried her further from the shadow of Derrick Walker, but she knew it would never fully disappear. It would follow her, not as a chain, but as a scar, a silent mark of survival. Sometimes she thought about Alyssa. She'd seen her once since the trial, playing in a hospital courtyard, a nurse chasing her through bubbles of sunlight. It was a small moment, but it reminded Mariah why she had spoken up. Because silence protects monsters, but truth, no matter how painful, protects everyone else. The years ahead would not be easy. The medications, the memories, the whispers would linger. But somewhere between pain and resilience, Both girls had begun to live again, and for the first time in Brookhaven's long, quiet history, people were beginning to listen, to ask, to notice, to believe. The darkness had not vanished. It never truly does. But it had a name now, and for the survivors, that meant everything. Brookhaven used to be a place where the night felt safe. Porch lights flickered on at dusk. Crickets filled the silence, and families gathered on steps to talk about nothing at all. But since the trial, the night had changed. Even the sound of the wind in the trees seemed heavier, as though the whole town was waiting for something to break the quiet. People spoke softly when they mentioned Derrick Raymond Walker, if they mentioned him at all. His name had become shorthand for what everyone feared but never thought could happen here. For years, Brookhaven had believed in the illusion that evil belonged somewhere else in bigger cities, in the stories they watched on television. That illusion was gone. The truth had come from their own neighborhood, down a narrow street lined with mailboxes and magnolia trees. When the verdict made front pages across Louisiana, Brookhaven tried to reckon with what it meant. The East Parish Sheriff's Office started a review of all registered offenders living within parish limits. They doubled the frequency of welfare checks, partnered with hospitals, and sent counselors into schools to speak with students about consent and safety, words that had never been part of public conversation before. The local paper ran a headline, "Out of silence, Brookhaven faces a shadow." It was the first time the town acknowledged that what happened wasn't just one man's crime. It was also the result of a community that hadn't wanted to see. At St. Luke's Regional Medical Center, doctors treated more than Alyssa's illness. They began hosting monthly workshops for parents on child safety and early intervention. Some of the nurses who had cared for Alyssa still carried her picture tucked in their lockers, a reminder that medicine wasn't only about healing bodies, but also protecting innocence. Alyssa herself was growing. The tiny toddler who once fought for her life was now a small child with bright eyes and a quiet strength. Her doctors said she was responding well to treatment. She didn't understand why her mother wept during checkups, or why the nurses called her our miracle. To her, the hospital was just a place where people wore kind smiles and gave her stickers. Her mother, Rachel, had rebuilt her life piece by piece. She moved apartments, started taking night classes, and began volunteering with advocacy groups for survivors of child abuse. Every time she stood in front of a new mother and told her story, she trembled, but she kept going. Pain, she'd learned, could become purpose if you gave her voice. In another corner of the parish, Mariah Danvers was starting over too. She'd returned to school under a new program designed for trauma survivors. Her teachers treated her gently, but she didn't want gentleness. She wanted normalcy. She sat near the back of the classroom, notebook open, writing words that only she would read. She still struggled with the stares, the pitying smiles, the weight of being known for something she never asked for. Yet each day she walked through those school doors was its own act of defiance. At night, she'd lie awake listening to the crickets outside her window, the same sound that once accompanied her fear. But now she found comfort in it. The night hadn't changed. It was she who had. There were moments when the past returned without warning. The smell of motor oil could make her heart race. The sight of a truck idling by the curb made her freeze. But therapy had given her language for those moments. She no longer saw herself as broken, only scarred. Scars, her therapist said, were proof of healing, not weakness. Walker's house on Cedar Lane still stood empty, boarded and overgrown. The parish wanted it demolished, but permits kept stalling, and no one wanted to set foot inside. Kids dared each other to touch the fence. No one ever crossed it. The weeds were taller than most of them, curling over the cracked steps where he used to sit. One evening, months after the trial, a group of volunteers planted a single oak sapling in the vacant lot across from that house. They said it was for Alyssa and Mariah, for every survivor who might one day find the courage to speak. The tree grew quickly, its roots cutting to the soil as if refusing to let the land forget. Some said it made the street feel lighter. Others said it was a warning. In the years that followed, Brookhaven became a different town. The people were more cautious, more watchful, but also more united. When a child went missing, no one waited to report it. When rumors spread about another assault, people demanded accountability. The silence that had once protected men like Walker was gone. Mariah graduated high school 2 years later. Her grandmother wept in the front row, clutching tissues in both hands. When Mariah walked across the stage, her classmates rose to their feet, not out of pity but respect. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't have to. The strength in her eyes said enough. That summer, she began writing for the local newspaper, the same one that had once printed the story of her own suffering. Her first article was titled, "What We Learn When We Finally Listen." It wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding trust, about how a community's real test begins after justice is served. In the final paragraph, she wrote, "Survival isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a different kind of courage. The courage to live again in a world that once tried to silence you." Alyssa's mother kept a copy of that article taped to her refrigerator. Every morning, while packing medicine and snacks for another hospital visit, she read it like a prayer. Brookhaven never truly slept again after Derrick Walker. But maybe that was the point. Some towns are meant to wake up and never fall back into the kind of sleep that lets monsters thrive. Years passed, and the story of Derrick Raymond Walker began to fade from headlines. The courthouse that once overflowed with cameras now held other trials, other tragedies. But for the people he'd hurt, time didn't erase the past. It only taught them how to live with it. Mariah Danvers was 21 when she stood again on Cedar Lane. The house where it all began was gone now, demolished by the parish a year earlier. In its place stood a fenced-off lot with wild grass and a single oak tree growing tall against the southern sky. She hadn't come here for closure. She had stopped believing in that word. Closure suggested a clean ending, and life, she had learned, never ended neatly. She came because she needed to see it for what it was, ordinary ground. No more power. No more shadows. Just soil reclaiming what had been taken. Mariah had built something like peace from the fragments of her old life. She'd gone to college with the help of a scholarship for victims of violent crime, majoring in social work. She wanted to help children like Alyssa, who might never know safety unless someone fought for it. Her voice, once shaky in courtrooms, had become strong in front of lecture halls. When she spoke about trauma, she didn't talk about what was lost. She talked about what survived. There were still nights when she woke in panic, the ghosts of her memories pressing too close. But she knew how to breathe through them now. She had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to let pain decide who you become. Alyssa Grant was 8 by then. She had a deep, dimpled smile and an endless curiosity about everything around her. Her mother, Rachel, had made their home in a brighter neighborhood outside Brookhaven, a place where the hospital wasn't just down the street. Every morning before school, Alyssa took her medication like clockwork, chasing it down with orange juice. She didn't mind the routine. She said the pills made her feel strong. Rachel didn't tell her the full story yet, only that she had been very sick once and that the doctors helped her get better. The rest would come when Alyssa was ready, when she was old enough to understand that survival doesn't always mean healing, and healing doesn't always mean forgetting. Rachel still drove past St. Luke's Regional Medical Center sometimes. The same brick walls, the same parking lot where she once cried into her hands, begging for a different outcome. But she didn't cry anymore. She found a kind of grace in knowing that despite everything, Alyssa was still here, alive, laughing, growing. The world had taken enough from her. Rachel refused to let it take her hope too. Every April, the town of Brookhaven held a remembrance walk through Cedar Lane. It started small, just a few families, a few candles, but grew each year. They called it the Walk for the Silent, honoring victims of abuse who never had the chance to speak. Mariah walked it every spring. She always carried a small white candle for Alyssa, lighting at the base of the oak tree that now shaded the lot where Walker's house once stood. The tree had grown enormous by then. Its branches stretched toward the street, casting a soft canopy of green light over the cracked sidewalk. Someone had nailed a small bronze plaque into the fence that read, "For every voice that was taken, and every truth that found its way back to the light." That night, as the procession passed, Mariah stopped beneath the tree and looked up through the branches. Fireflies drifted in the dark, blinking like quiet heartbeats. For the first time in years, She didn't feel afraid of the night. The air smelled like rain and earth, and for once, it felt like the town was breathing again. She thought of Alyssa, of the little girl's smile, the energy she carried despite everything inside her. Maybe that was what survival truly meant. Not pretending the darkness hadn't existed, but daring to live brightly anyway. When the ceremony ended, the candles burned low. Mariah stayed until the last one flickered out, then turned toward the sound of distant laughter. Children running down the street, their voices rising through the humid air. It struck her how easily joy could return to a place that had once felt cursed. The world hadn't forgotten what happened here. It never should, but neither had it been defined by it. In the end, Brookhaven was more than its tragedy. It was the home of a girl who found her courage, a child who learned to live with light in her blood, and a mother who turned pain into purpose. Mariah took one last look at the oak tree before walking away. Its leaves shimmered in the streetlight, green and gold, like 1,000 small reminders that even in the darkest soil, something living can still take root. The town slept lighter now, never in complete silence, never unguarded, but awake enough to remember. And in that awareness, there was something close to peace.